remarks on Antigone in the light of Slavoj Zizek's recent lecture on the surplus of happiness. Leo Strauss has pointed out that in tragedies, the Agamemnon, for instance, we mostly get the names of heroes or mythical figures, whereas in Platon, we mostly get dialogues based on living persons or contemporaries, the Theaetetus, for example. In the case of a disputed dialogue, but I think Strauss holds it to be authentic, and for what it's worth, I also think it's authentic. The Minos. This is a dialogue that is meant to be a theoretical dialogue, in contradistinction to a dialogue about the polis. So the Minos is about the idea of law, and it attempts to say as much as can be said without giving human details, whereas the nomoi, or the laws, takes place in a specific location on Crete and involves somebody called the Athenian stranger and other specific old men of the Spartan or Lacedaemonian people, the Athenian stranger being probably a reimagined history of what Socrates would have done had he fled rather than drunk the hemlock. He would have gone to Crete and had this discussion about the laws. But it's all, just as with the Politeia, that involves the old man Cephalus, the arms dealer, and numerous actual people who lived in Athens and who Platon knew personally, and Socrates himself. It's rich in the texture of gossip of daily life. So the Antigone is written during the life of Socrates, maybe 40 years before he died, in a period in Athens where these problems had been raised already for 150 years regarding the public knowledge of the laws. Okay, so Zizek has made, what interested me particularly in this is Zizek ends his speech in an incoherent message that he points out correctly that Antigone has chosen something irreplaceable as against something replaceable. The death of her brother, being as her parents are presumably already dead, the brother can't be replaced, whereas she says that a spouse or child could be replaced. This attitude I find totally accessible. I don't find it too alien personally, but it may be alien to the general culture, I think. The notion, because we have the fetishizing of children, and the notion that they have their lives out ahead of them, and therefore their rational notion, as it seems to me, therefore more valuable. But of course in antiquity it would have been thought that if the polis has put all its efforts into the husbandry of human beings, into raising human beings, then the newborn child is worth much less than the already produced adult, which Apollos has put all its best resources into. So then, after pointing out that there's this, her own brother is at issue, and that the irreplaceability of the brother, he then goes on to speak of morality not being about universals, but it be about a choice, as though she had made a choice over who her sibling was. So this seems to me trivially incoherent account. Okay, so let's give a more coherent account of what's going on in the Antigone. The general conclusion of the Athenians of what politics is about is a conflict between one's own, what is one's own, which is to say the country, or we can best picture what a polis is by calling it a country, rather than this confused notion of city-state or citizen-state or something else. One has a country, so for instance, Russia, and then against it there's something called the politeia, which is a specific regime of principles, ordering principles. In the present context, the spreading of democracy would somehow, or of republic. Let's say that's much better, the Republican form of government, let's call it that way. By which I mean a government by the people, for the people, and of the people, has standing in contradistinction to something like the Saudi system, which is a government for the king, for their own purpose. And this is supposed to be the distinction between, by the way, the general distinction between rational and irrational, as established by Plato and Socrates. Or in more modern language, a distinction between arbitrary rule and rule of law. The conflict comes in where you have a country, say Russia, and then has a specific regime, so the czarist regime, and then it has the word regime is taken as a translation of politeia, as a specific regime, and then it changes to the Soviet regime, and then some people are alienated, let's say, and but the problem is it's still their country, it's still Russia, but the regime, they might not like the regime, or I don't like to say in the case of the Nazi regime, because I don't believe the current propaganda of that. I think there's plenty of people, including Heisenberg and his wife, who were perfectly decent people and who supported the Nazi regime, and including Heidegger. Is late, and I totally think the Caputo arguments, which I came to basically independently, for instance, that the Charlie Chaplin, who was a Jew and who made the Great Dictator movie, did not think Hitler was evil when he made the movie. He thought Hitler was about the same as Churchill. So we have this juxtaposition Zizek gives in the present speech between between Churchill's Blood, Sweat, and Tears speech and Goebbels' Total War speech, with some slight differences. So it seems to me obvious that quite a few Germans could have been perfectly happy under the Nazi regime, even though they were practicing hot eugenics, murder. But we practice the same thing in a cool way. We practice commercial eugenics, so the people that aren't fit for commercial society die off. but we just don't kill them directly. Or they live a miserable, marginal life and are, as Zoe has here in Berkeley, it's within the wealthy country, you see constantly people in rags, covered literally in humiliation, walking around with no money to buy even a cup of coffee, and people mocking them for being mentally ill because, of course, obviously, if you're being in misery and don't even have money to buy any of the creature comforts of daily life, you're not going to be very happy. And you're not going to be behave the way people that do have those comforts do. I think that's obvious. So I think there's not such a big, a clear distinction between the evil of active, direct eugenics, of murder, and the evil of slower and more masked forms of eugenics. It amounts to something similar. And of course, also we have the most, as Dean Martha Minow says in the Harvard Law School, we're the most incarcerated country in the history of incarceration by a proportion of the population that's in prisons, and part of those prisons are a commercial enterprise. But nonetheless, we could see in that example, because it happened so rapidly, the distinction between Deutschland and, on the other hand, the regime of the National Socialist Party, and then the two regimes that followed in the East and in the West after the end of the war. That's the basic, according to the classical thinking, which Sophocles knew, because it had been going on for more than 100 years since the time of Draco and Solon, and which we could signal with Aristotle's comment that if you change the laws too often, people don't like it. Then it kind of shows that the law is fickle, it's fake in a way. But if you leave the laws the same for a long time, then most people get used to it. And this is partially rational, because then you can expect the result and plan accordingly, which is certainly a rational function of law. So from that perspective, the play Antigone is bringing every Athenian who was compelled as a duty to go to the tragedies and to participate in them emotionally, ethically, intellectually, like a powwow, something like Indian powwow, to shed tears, to have catharsis, but to be educated by them. So this is educating them to see these are the conflicts that we, the Athenians, are dealing with, and here's one face of this conflict. There's something that is one's own, the family, the brother of Antigone, on analogy with one having one's own country. And then there's this figure, Creon, who was like, let's say, the Hitler figure in a certain sense, who comes in and says, here's all these laws. Like Hitler passed a law that said the fish tanks must be rounded so the fish don't get hurt. And that anyone who breaks through a road barrier, official road barrier, will be executed immediately. All kinds of laws that appear somewhat arbitrary. So then Creon decides, okay, we're not going to bury this person. And in a way it's arbitrary, even though a rationalization is given that he was a traitor or whatever. So we have this juxtaposition between the onmost and the current regime as represented by the semi-wicked Creon. I'm not sure if Creon is supposed to be all that wicked is, so far as the vulgar understanding of Hitler as another name for evil would paint him. These things are all amorphous. I mean, if evil just means very harmful, it seems to me we could easily say as much harm as if not way more is happening under the regime of the people that won World War II than would have been happening if the man in the high castle had been true, the Philip K. Dick version of the Axis powers winning the war, because the people being murdered were a small proportion, and then if you took it just from a utilitarian perspective, you'd have to say, yeah, maybe there was a lot of people that were actually happy under that regime. Taking happy in a very vague way, or they would flourish under that regime. Just as one can say of America, since we have now the people's history of America and so forth, one can say, okay, America is built on several genocides, on slavery, on out-and-out oppression, in the sense that the founding documents as a whole, people are created equal, but they allowed for slavery, so that's out-and-out oppression, because you have a principle, you're aware of it, and you directly violate it. Just as an aside, I'd say anyone who wants to interject and suddenly say, oh, but you're making all these moral equivalencies, this is nihilism, etc., etc., but I think that case has a lot to be proved. It has a high level of proof to show that you're really in the virtuous situation as, for instance, in the recent discussion between Anderson Cooper and Cornel West, where Anderson Cooper would not accept the Cornel West saying that if 500,000 or more people being killed in Iraq. Anderson Cooper had been in Iraq during probably both the wars, was in any way equivalent to these terrible Russian crimes, Russian aggression. How many people have died in Ukraine due to Russian aggression? Is it anything like 500,000? No, but he's ready to say Putin, that genocidal, aggressive Putin, Russian, must be evil. But the Americans can't possibly be guilty of anything in Libya, in Iraq, etc. So I think that's a high level. I think that's the burden of proof for the people that want to say we can't fall into moral equivalencies here. We're at risk unless we make clear who the good guys and who the bad guys are. From that point of view, there's a double look. I think from the Sophocles himself, since he's dealing with these issues and trying to make them clear to the Athenians, he's superimposing them over a period, archaic period, prior to the classical period, so that we have the image of Antigone, who lived in the archaic period, and one might think here's these sort of mores, and these people are supposed to be buried. It's almost like superstition. Otherwise, the miasma and the suke will run rampant over the people. They must be buried. It's like a cult thing. The archaic, there would be another reading about the archaic figure of Antigone that Sophocles has taken and used as his hule, or as his timber, so to speak, in his art as a tragedian, and then used to superimpose the, as it were, the ideas which were modern for the epoch of, the first epoch of political philosophy.